Thank you for joining us on OpenLine. We are doing our best to get you up to speed on day one of the Vanderbilt rape retrial for Brandon Vandenberg. We want to dive right back on into the defense's opening statements. Here you go.
We know that they did go to her apartment complex because her shoes were found on the lawn the next day. When they get to Gillette, and Mr. Vandenberg, rather than try to carry her from her apartment at the Villages at Vandy, it's not a great distance, but it's probably farther than you'd want to carry someone. He gets Miss in her car and drives her over to Gillette Hall. And you'll see when he gets there, he parks somewhere where he's not supposed to. He parks in a fire lane. And in his intoxicated state, doesn't even notice that there's a police car parked about 30 yards away. And he gets out of the car. Now, Gillette Hall, one thing you've got to understand about Gillette Hall is it's a dorm at Vanderbilt, and they have security there. They have a card system. To get in, to open the doors, you have to swipe a card. To take the elevator to an upper floor, you have to swipe a card. To get into the hallway after you get out of the elevator on your floor, you have to swipe a card. And Mr. Vandenberg realizes that he can't carry and swipe the card, so he knows he needs some help. And he sees a fellow that he recognizes as a football player because he's seen him at the football complex before. But he did not know this fellow's name. But he goes up to him and asks him for help. And they're talking about what they're going to do and how he's, he can't carry and swipe and all that. And while they're talking, Corey Beatty and Brandon Banks also come up. And what you'll learn about these three is that they're like brothers. They know each other. Mr. McKenzie, that's the way he characterized it. Mr. Banks, at least, he said he's like my brother. They knew each other very well. But none of these three had ever said a word to Mr. Vandenberg. Mr. Vandenberg had never talked to them before. He did not know them. They did not know him. And he asked for their help. And they agreed to help. But they weren't going to help Mr. Vandenberg, and they were going to help themselves. And you will see on the surveillance videos, you will see Mr. Vandenberg carry into the dorm. And you will also see him carry her to the elevator and takes her into the elevator, lays her on the floor. Mr. Banks is in the elevator with him, and you can see Mr. Banks already eyeing. And you can see Corey Beatty step into the elevator, and you can see Mr. Vandenberg say, no, we'll go up. You can see him pushing out. And after the elevator door closes, you'll see Corey Beatty and Brandon Banks whooping it up, laughing, shaking their heads, smiling, because they know what they're planning to do. Mr. Vandenberg's not there when they're planning to do it. And you're going to see some things. You're going to see Mr. Vandenberg do some things that he shouldn't have done. And one of the first things you're going to see is when they get out of the elevator in the second floor, he lays floor. She falls over, and he begins laughing. As Detective Mayo characterized it in one of his questionings. He says, "You were laughing at the drunk girl, that's understandable." And if any of you remember, Foster Brooks used to be on television, and he was a comedian, and that was his shtick. He would act like he was drunk, and people would laugh. And Mr. Vandenberg, he was drunk, and he was laughing. And he takes his camera out, and he starts taking pictures. It's not something he should have done. Would he have done it had he been in his right mind? We don't know. But you'll also see Brandon Banks take his phone out and begin taking photographs also. At this point in time on the second floor, it's only Mr. Banks and Mr. Vandenberg. But shortly after Mr. Vandenberg picks back up to carry her to his room, then you see Banks and you see Beatty and McKenzie come out of the elevator and follow them down the hall. And this is when they end up in Mr. Vandenberg's room. And Mr. McKenzie says in one of his statements that he and Mr. Banks and Mr. Beatty had all been drinking, excuse me, but that he and Mr. Banks were not on the same level, as he put it, as Mr. Beatty and Mr. Vandenberg. And he said that those two didn't know what they were doing. And Mr. McKenzie says that when they first got into the room, they sat around and had small talk. Talked about how Mr. Vandenberg came to Vanderbilt. And while they're doing the small talk, as he puts it, Mr. Beatty starts acknowledging the young lady laying on the floor. And Mr. Beatty begins touching her breasts, touching her vaginal area, and Mr. Beatty begins taking her underwear off. And then everything else ensues from that.